Greetings. This is August 3rd, Tuesday afternoon. We're in Sylva, North Carolina, or approximately in Sylva, North Carolina. And I'm Avram Friedman. I'm the chairman of the Political Action Committee of the Jackson County branch of the NAACP. And I'm here today with Betsy Swift and Chris Tabor, and please introduce yourself and tell us what organization you're representing.
Okay, thanks, Avram. I'm Betsy. I'm from the local Indivisible, which is called Indivisible Common Ground WNC. I'm part of the leadership team.
Okay. I'm going to adjust this microphone a little because it's blocking out your face. Yeah, let's... Okay,
Yeah,
that's better, isn't it? Yeah, okay. That's why you were telling me earlier that we should do that. Okay. How about you, Chris? Are you good?
Yeah.
Good.
And I'm Chris Tabor. I am a resident of Sylva, and I am part of the Political Action Committee of the NAACP of Jackson County.
And you also represent some other organizations as well, don't you?
I'm not currently an active member, but I am still a member of Down Home, North Carolina. And that's really all right now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And we're here to talk about voting rights and all the issues revolving around that are happening right now. It's a very hot issue on the national, state, and local levels. Probably those who are watching this are aware of various measures that are being passed all over the country that result in voter suppression, and that includes such things as purging of the polls of hundreds of thousands, actually millions of voters nationwide, gerrymandering in certain states, which is resulting in the underrepresentation of certain populations, and many other things, including the closing of polling places, the requirement of voter IDs, and what else am I leaving out? Well, let's there are many things I haven't talked about, but this is a document from a group or an organization called the Brennan Center for Justice.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar?
Yes.
With them? And they have listed all the various types of voter suppression that is going on, that have bills that have passed and bills that are pending in I think it's 17 different states right now, possibly more by now. I don't know exactly how old this was. This I printed off the internet from May 2021. And so these are the various things that it lists: shortening the window to apply for a mail-in ballot, shortening the deadline to deliver mail-in ballots, making it harder to remain an on absentee voting lists, eliminating or limiting sending mailing ballot applications to voters who do not specifically request them, eliminating or limiting sending mail ballots to voters who do not specifically. I said, I don't know why they list that twice. Specifically request them. Restrict assistance in returning a voter's mailing ballot, limiting the number, location, or availability of mailing ballot, drop boxes, imposing strict, significant requirements for mail ballots, tightening or imposing voter ID requirements for mail-in voting, tightening or imposing voter ID requirements for in-person voting, expanding voter purges or risk faulty voter purges, ban snacks and water to voters waiting online. You've probably heard about that one. Eliminating election day registration, reducing polling places availability. So that's this list, and there may be others that other organizations have listed as well.
Another thing is there's kind of a war on provisional voting. Like if somebody shows up at the wrong precinct,
Right.
their vote, you cast what's called a provisional vote, and then the local board of elections decides if that's going to count.
Right.
And they might allow it for the federal level, but not for like the school board. Because you might have the wrong ballot for your school board if you're in the wrong precinct. But some of these measures in some states have just won an all-out, like to make provisional ballots more and more restricted.
And even with existing laws, very often provisional ballots don't get
No,
counted.
about 50% of them don't get counted, but
and
they at least are considered.
They,
you know,
they,
they're
they may be
considered.
considered, but people go in thinking they've voted, and then it turns out that their ballots
Right,
aren't
they've done the best.
counted.
They've done the best they can,
Right.
and it's a. And once, at least in our county, one of the advantages of a provisional ballot is maybe your registration wasn't found, and you were able to cast a provisional ballot. That is a situation where that's not going to count. They weren't registered to vote, but they are now registered to vote. But that provisional ballot constitutes voter registration, so it's a way to get people to kind of capitalize on the fact that that person showed up to vote,
Right.
and not turn them away. Whereas I think the newer laws they're all meant to just tamp down turnout, basically.
And very often, like a person will be given a provisional ballot if they show up at the wrong precinct, and the reason
Yes.
they show up at the wrong precinct is because in the last election it was the right precinct, but the election officials
Right.
have shifted around the precincts, and this person for some reason didn't get notified or missed a postcard that was sent in the mail that did notify them.
Right.
And so as a result, their sacred right to vote has been canceled, or put in as a provisional ballot, which may or may not get counted. Right. So, I wanted to talk about some of the. Let me see. Some of the things that are happening to counter these measures that are being taken. There are several groups. There are many groups. The four that I've been getting email from, a lot has been unsolicited email, but I'm glad I'm getting it anyway. I guess I must be on many people's lists. But the Poor People's Campaign has an enormous coalition of organizations that are working with them. That's it's the Poor People's Campaign was started by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. back in the 1960s, and when he was assassinated, it kind of lay dormant all that time until Reverend William Barber, or the Bishop William Barber now, decided to take up the reins of the Poor People Campaign, and he reactivated it. And he's been doing an amazing job. I don't know how he keeps up with it the way he does. It seems like every day he's doing something else, recording another message, going out. He was arrested at the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. on June 23rd, along with Reverend Jesse Jackson and about 20 other people. And since then, several Congress people have been arrested. I mean, scores, if not hundreds of people have been taking part in this direct action, nonviolent disobedience, to get legislation passed that will counter some of these laws that are being passed in the states that were passed in order to suppress the vote, particularly among minorities, poor people in general, women, students, the elderly, the disabled, making it more difficult to vote. And I don't know, maybe you can add something to that, Chris, about why it's difficult for some of these groups to meet some of the requirements that are being forced upon them.
Well, for one thing, for example, just the voter ID law. It's not so much just that people may not have ID because they don't need to drive or whatever other reason they may not have one. To prove that you have an ID in order to access a mail-in vote, then you have to go and copy your ID someplace. And that's maybe more trickier than people realize, to actually get a copy of the vote of that, as well as the provisions for getting a witness. Now, I myself had to get my ballot witness during in order to vote by mail, and my elderly neighbor, who's a sweetheart, but who I didn't know who else to ask, signed it, but with the wrong zip code. And when I went to the voter place, they did accept that because we live in such a small place that they happened to know my neighbor and realized she was in fact a legitimate resident, and therefore accepted the ballot. But a simple mistake such as that on the witness, or simply not being able to get a copy made, even if you did have a license or some other form of identification which is quote unquote acceptable, then I think all of those things make voting much more difficult. I happen to have a neighbor who's disabled, and she can write, but she cannot talk. So how is she going to communicate in order to request the ballot in the first place? Not great on a computer, can just various technological difficulties. So there's a lot of reasons why people perhaps that are in rural areas without the broadband access, maybe they don't have a close neighbor they can just ask. Maybe they have some physical limitation that limits their ability to sign things. All of these reasons make it far more difficult than it should be to simply request the ballot and physically get it filled out and turned over to somebody, because you need to be able to drive, you need to be able to use the technology, you need to find a witness, all of these things which are not as easy as they may sound. Some people think, hey, what's the problem? Get your ID, why don't you have an ID? Well, a lot of people don't. What if you just got out of jail and you don't have an ID? Or you're homeless and your items have been stolen and you lost all your identification, which happens routinely to homeless populations. Those people deserve to be represented the same as the rest
Sure
of
they
us.
do. And sometimes, even if it's a small amount, it costs money if you, to buy a car, certainly, or to own a car, to register the car, or to hire a cab to take you, or an Uber, or whatever it is. What's the difference between that and a poll tax,
Right.
which was an issue in the 1960s, and one of the reasons the 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed was to eliminate the poll tax, and it was declared unconstitutional to require people to pay in order to vote, because voting is not a privilege. It's a right. It's the most sacred right that citizens have in our country, and that's another argument that's used by the people who are attempting to pass these voter suppression laws. They're saying, well, if you go to fly somewhere on an airplane,
That's,
You-
don't get me started.
Well, I
You
want
know,
to get
yeah,
you
yeah.
started. That's exactly what I want to do. But then you need a vote. You need an ID card.
Right.
To do
The
that.
comparisons that are made between showing an ID at a place of, where you're getting medical care or to fly on an airplane, those security issues and are just not comparable to the act of voting, which is a right that we're guaranteed in the Constitution, and which really, if we consider ourselves a representative democracy, voting defines who we are as a country. If people aren't voting, we don't have a representative democracy, period.
Yeah.
And people cite the desire to eliminate fraud, but fraud in the form of impersonating a registered voter is so rare it's almost hard to measure. It's something like 0.0000003% of the votes are fraudulently cast. A handful out of the many millions of votes that
And in
are
fact, the
cast.
only ones that were caught at fraudulence or
Were
were Republicans in Pennsylvania or something.
Yeah.
It's a false.
And of course, we had our
flag.
own fraud issue after the midterm, the 2018 midterms down in District 9, I think, where that congressman, somebody
In
running
North
for Congress in
Carolina,
North
yes.
Carolina, had somebody going around collecting absentee ballots, which is so against the law, even going so far as to tell people, don't bother, I'll fill it in for you.
Yeah.
Just sign here.
And
I'll fill it
he
in for you.
throwing out ballots that didn't have the right.
So there's our
votes on 'em,
incidence
yeah.
of fraud, and
Yes.
it was not,
So in a sense, they're projecting. They're saying, "Well, we do this kind of thing, so the
that-
Democrats must be doing it
yeah,
too."
Right.
And yeah, I mean that's the kind of thing that's happening. But voter fraud, as far as we can tell, is virtually non-existent in this
Yeah,
country. But the people that are being impacted by the voter suppression laws or these laws that are being passed to prevent fraud, that's the rationale for passing them, are impacting millions of voters across the country. And so it's like these measures are doing the exact opposite of what they're supposed to be doing. They're impacting an election in a negative manner, in a way that is disenfranchising millions of voters in this country.
In general, high turnout is thought to favor Democrats. So
Right.
the Republican strategy to win elections is to limit Democratic turnout, not come up with new ideas that people are going to find appealing,
Right.
but to limit Democratic turnout. So that seems to be their only strategy right now going forward.
Well, it's kind of sad that they feel like they can't use the democratic process to win voters over. That they don't feel like they can win a majority of votes, and so therefore they have to eliminate the voters they don't want to vote.
Yeah, they do. That's it. I mean, I feel us sliding toward a very authoritarian form of government. Were they to succeed in preventing for example, preventing the For the People Act from going forward,
Yeah.
without the measures that would basically the For the People Act would create a floor below which the states can't go. It's like they call it a backstop. It prevents the states from making laws that would disenfranchise people. And I kind of forgot where I was going with this, but
Well, let me help you with that a little bit. I copied this description of the For the
yeah,
People Act
yeah.
from the congressional website. So this is actually the description that's on the bill itself. Here, instead of me reading it,
okay,
why don't
thank
you do that? Yeah.
I'll read it. S1, For the People Act of 2021. This bill addresses voter access, election integrity and security, campaign finance, and ethics for the three branches of government. Specifically, the bill expands voter registration, for example, automatic and same-day registration, and voting access, for example, vote by mail and early voting. It also limits removing voters from voter rolls. The bill requires states to establish independent redistricting commissions to carry out congressional redistricting. Very timely, and the reason we really need to get it passed fast, because that's about to happen.
Yes.
Additionally, the bill sets forth provisions related to election security, including sharing intelligence information with state election officials, supporting states in securing their election systems, developing a national strategy to protect U.S. democratic institutions, establishing in the legislative branch the National Commission to Protect United States Democratic Institutions, and other provisions to improve the cybersecurity of election systems. Further, the bill addresses campaign finance, including by expanding the prohibition on campaign spending by foreign nationals, requiring additional disclosure of campaign-related fundraising and spending, requiring additional disclaimers regarding certain political advertising, and establishing an alternative campaign funding system for certain federal offices. The bill addresses ethics in all three branches of government, including by requiring a code of conduct for Supreme Court justices, prohibiting members of the House from serving on the board for a for-profit entity, and establishing additional conflict of interest and ethics provisions for federal employees and the White House. This bill requires the president, the vice president, and certain candidates for those offices to disclose 10 years of tax returns.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a very comprehensive piece of legislation. And what's very interesting to me about this is that it includes campaign finance limitations, which is a huge issue. I mean, most people have heard of the Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court. And why that's so important is, and this is something I just recently learned, 92% of all elections in the United States of America are won by the candidate who spends the most money. 92%.
I've never heard that statistic, but wow.
Yeah. And so what's happened because of the Citizens United and other Supreme Court decisions subsequently and before Citizens United, which defines corporations as people and money as speech, what it's doing is it's allowing what we call dark money into campaigns. So if a corporation, while it cannot directly contribute to a political campaign, it can contribute to a super PAC or a political action committee. And once it does that, that political action committee can spend the money on any candidate they want to without disclosing the source of the funds. So you can have an unlimited amount of money, millions of dollars, that in dark money supporting candidates, and the public isn't aware that that's the money that's influencing the candidate. And of course, once a candidate gets elected, they're going, almost certainly, they're going to be looking out for the interests of their large donors. They are beholden to those interests, and so if that's who they are representing in Congress or in any public position, then they're not representing the voters, the
right.
interests of the voters.
Exactly.
So just the recent revelation about Exxon's contributions to Joe Manchin, and that they had access to him every single week, influencing his votes that impact climate change for all of us,
Yes.
means that Exxon is in fact controlling a legislature not the people he's supposed to be representing.
Right, and of course we know Joe Manchin comes from West Virginia, and he's very much influenced by the coal industry, the coal mining industry in West Virginia as well, another fossil fuel interest, enormous fossil fuel interest. And as it happens, Joe Manchin is probably the most conservative Democrat in Congress, in the Senate, and with a 50-50 split in the Senate, Vice President Kamala Harris provides the majority that would be needed if the Democrats voted as a bloc. For instance, to pass the We the People Act. But Joe Manchin has said that he will not vote for it, and right now, because of the filibuster rule, 60 votes are needed, not just 50, to overcome the filibuster. And Joe Manchin has said that he would not vote to end the filibuster rule, or even change. Well, there's some rumors that he might be willing to change the filibuster rules. I think it was in 2009 the filibuster rule changed. It used to be a very rarely used procedural vote in Congress, in the Senate, where and the way it used to be used, if a member of the minority wanted to block the passage of a bill, they would have to physically stand up and talk and continue to talk as long as he or she could, and it would take 60 votes to stop him from talking, or him or her from talking. But in 2009, it was simplified. I'm not exactly sure, to conserve time or whatever, but the rule was changed just all the minority has to do is say, we're going to filibuster this, and then it would have to, it would need 60 votes to pass.
So they pay no price for it. They can even do that in an email.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. They don't pay the price of standing in front of the legislature.
Right.
A famous story, and I came from New York, and when I was in high school, I think, our state senator filibustered for I forget how long, but it was an actual physical getting up there and talking for 36 hours.
This is in New York State? They have a filibuster rule as well?
No, he was our U.S. senator.
Oh, I see.
Alphonse D'Amato.
Oh, I remember D'Amato.
Catheterized himself and
Yeah.
stood up for over 24 hours to filibuster. But it was a big story when it happened, because it was uncomfortable and they didn't do it lightly. But now it's just, you can do it on your email.
Right.
Right.
And so that serves as a means of obstruction that didn't previously exist. And something that many people may not know is that the filibuster is not part of the Constitution.
Right.
There's nothing in the Constitution that talks about the filibuster rule. It's just simply a Senate rule that was passed sometime after the Constitution was written, and it's not a law. It's just a Senate rule that can be changed by the Senate at any time, if a majority chooses to do that. So that's another aspect of the Poor People's Campaign. That there are 5 things that the Poor People's Campaign is demanding in their current direct action campaign. The first one is to end the filibuster, and the second is to pass the provisions of the For the People Act, and the third one is to fully restore the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which is embodied in the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. The fourth thing is to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, and the fifth is to fully protect all 11 million undocumented immigrants. Now, that is the so that's what the Poor People's Campaign is going to do. And we read what's in the Senate Bill 1, which is, incidentally, Senate Bill 1 has already passed in the House of Representatives.
Right.
It was House Bill 1, and now it's Senate Bill 1. It's the identical piece of legislation. And the only thing that's stopping it is the votes of a few Democrats. Joe Manchin in West Virginia, Kristen Sinema in Arizona, and I think John Tester in Montana, and maybe one or two others. You know, we're very close to getting it passed. It's already passed in the House, and so much is riding on this piece of legislation. If it doesn't pass, then all these voter suppression laws will likely stand.
Yeah.
Because the Supreme Court is not overturning them. There's a 7-3 conservative majority in the Supreme Court. However, Joe Manchin has said that he would support the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancements Act. Again, he can say that easily because he's not going to come out. He's not going to come out against the filibuster. Or at least he says he's not going to. And Republicans have said that they wouldn't pass this either. So there's not enough Republican support, not any Republican support, to get the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. But Chris, how about if you'll read the provisions of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act?
So, this is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2019. This bill establishes new criteria for determining which states and political subdivisions must obtain pre-clearance before changes to voting practices in these areas may take effect. Pre-clearance is the process of receiving pre-approval from the Department of Justice or the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia before making legal changes that would affect voting rights. A state and all of its political subdivisions shall be subject to pre-clearance of voting practice changes for a 10-year period if 1, 15 or more voting rights violations occurred in the state during the previous 25 years, or 2, 10 or more violations occurred during the previous 25 years, at least one of which was committed by the state itself. A political subdivision as a separate unit shall also be subject to pre-clearance for a 10-year period if 3 or more voting rights violations occurred there during the previous 25 years. A state or political subdivision that obtains a declaratory judgment that is not used a voting practice to deny or abridge the right to vote shall be exempt from pre-clearance. All jurisdictions must pre-clear changes to requirements for documentation to vote that make the requirements more stringent than federal requirements for voters who register by mail or state law. The bill specifies practices, jurisdictions meeting certain thresholds regarding racial minority groups, language minority groups, or minority groups on Indian land must pre-clear before implementing. These practices include changes to methods of election, changes to jurisdiction boundaries, redistricting, changes to voting locations and opportunities, and changes to voter registration list maintenance. The bill expands the circumstances under which 1. A court may retain the authority to pre-clear voting changes made by a state or political subdivision, or 2. The Department of Justice may assign election observers. States and political subdivisions must notify the public of changes to voting practices. The bill revises the circumstances under which a court must grant preliminary injunctive relief in a challenge to voting practices.
Okay. So this is essentially the same provisions that were required under the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which, and up until, what was the year that the Supreme Court gutted the,
I think 2015.
in 2015, I think you're right. So what happened was that, I think it was North Carolina, passed a voter suppression law, a voter restriction law, and it was a court case was brought against them by the NAACP and other groups, and it was overturned. The state law was overturned in the lower federal court, in the Court of Appeals, in the district court, and then it went to the Court of Appeals, and they maintained the lower court's decision, but then it went to the Supreme Court, that at that point had a 5-4 conservative majority, justices that were appointed by conservative Republican presidents, and they overturned the lower court decision and allowed, and as a result, overturned the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was heresy. I mean, it was a sacred law. You know, it enabled so many people to vote that had previously been denied that right. The Supreme Court essentially said that discrimination doesn't exist anymore.
Right. John Roberts sort of declared that all over. Now it's all over now, and we're beyond that. But it's quite obvious that we're not.
Obviously not. But now the conservative majority has been increased because of the appointees by President Trump, and now there's a 7-3 majority after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died last summer. There's little hope that they would ever reverse that decision, even though it's so blatantly obvious that there are states that have a history of discrimination and maintain that history today through these voter suppression laws. But Congress can overrule the Supreme Court by passing a new law. It can be challenged in court again, and it may be if it does get passed. But so essentially, that's the thrust of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act.
The way that it addresses what, the original Voting Rights Act specified certain states that were subjected to preclearance. What this does is make that preclearance conditioned on evidence of discrimination, which you might find in any of the 50 states.
Yeah.
And so it broadens it really in a way that I think is
necessarily so, because there are other states that
so it gets at the Supreme Court's objection by broadening it to everybody. Well, let's see, we're not taking you and saying you're discriminating. We're saying everybody's likely to do this.
And it's true. Like in states like Wisconsin, I think, and Michigan, perhaps
Missouri,
Minnesota,
Iowa,
I think, where Republicans have taken over the state legislatures and have gerrymandered the districts so badly that, like, even in North Carolina, in the last election in 2020, I believe this is correct, Democrats actually received close to 51% of the vote, but only got like 43% of the representation, and it's actually worse than that. I think that's what it is on the state level, but on congressional districts, North Carolina has 13 congressional districts. And only, I think, 5 of them are now Democratic. Even though, so there's 5 Democrats and 8 Republicans representing North Carolina. But if you count up all the votes statewide for Democratic candidates, it amounted to over 50%. So even
Just
though
how we got a Democratic governor, but because it's not, the governor is statewide. So
Right, you can't gerrymander the governor.
It reflects
Right.
the balance in the whole state.
Right,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah.
So that's how lopsided, and how manipulated the process has become, where an obvious, a great majority actually of Democrats is underrepresented dramatically. So,
Yeah,
and that's true in North Carolina. It's true in other states as well, and so I'm not certain if the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act actually addresses gerrymandering.
no, it doesn't.
But
It's very,
Senate Bill 1 does.
yes, it does.
And so that's an important distinction. Another thing that is not addressed in the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is voter purging, voter roll purging.
Right.
And I want to read this. This is a report from the Brennan Center of Justice, some research they did. It says, voter purges are an often flawed process of cleaning up voter rolls by deleting names from registration lists. While updating registration lists as voters die, move, or otherwise become ineligible is necessary and important, when done irresponsibly with bad data or when two voters are confused for the same person, the process can knock eligible voters off the roll en masse, often with little notice. Many voters discover they're no longer listed only when they arrive at the polling place. As a result, many eligible Americans either don't vote or are forced to cast provisional ballots. Again, they're forced into provisional ballots. Over the last decade, jurisdictions have substantially increased the rate at which they purge voter rolls. Brennan Center research found that between 2014 and 2016, states removed almost 16 million voters from the rolls, a 33% increase over the period between 2006 and 2008, and the increase was highest in states with a history of voting discrimination. So it's pretty clear what's going on here. There's people are being purged from the polls. Many times it can just be because they have the same name as someone who died.
Yeah.
So
That's about 10% of all the people
who voted,
eligible
period.
voters of people who
That's
vote,
how
yeah.
much this is.
Yeah,
This
that's
alone
amazing.
is impacting the vote. Imagine if those 10% had been added in 2016 to the presidential, and in 2020 again the same thing. But not only for president, for Congress.
Yeah.
How many more representatives would there? How that would have shifted the balance so much. So, in addition to research and monitoring voter purges, the Brennan Center provides legal assistance and advocacy to ensure that voter purges are non-discriminatory and do not disenfranchise eligible voters. So that it's well worth looking that up. The Brennan, that's Brennan Center. I believe that's after former Supreme Court Justice Brennan.
Maybe.
I believe that's a foundation that he began. So this is a very substantial and trustworthy organization. And if you need more information about voting suppression issues, it's a great site to look up. The Brennan Center for Justice. Let's see, is there anything else we want to cover? So we are locally planning an event on August 28th on the campus of WCU. Is that true?
I'm unclear on that. I'm sorry. I
Okay.
should have
Well,
looked
we
that
had
up
talked
before I came. We
about
did.
doing
We
that.
talked about something. That's the same day as greening up the mountains. So
Right, and that's
can't
why we
remember how-
decided to move it to campus.
to campus. Okay.
Right.
Right. So we are. Yeah. But I don't really remember anything about it. So let's not go there.
Well, as the conversation that I remember, we held a candlelight vigil in downtown Silva. The Indivisible Common Ground and the NAACP in
Yes.
Jackson County held a candlelight vigil in the rain. It was very dramatic. And the president of the NAACP was there and made a statement, Dr. Dana Patterson. And so what we're planning on doing on the August 28th, there is a nationwide series of events happening all over the country, and we had talked about, and I thought we decided that we were going to hold such an event here. It was conflicting with a big event that happens in Silva every year called Greening Up the Mountains, which was moved to that date because of
the
the
pandemic.
pandemic. It's usually held around Earth
April,
Day
yeah.
in April. Yeah. But so we decided we'd move it to campus that evening, which is after the Greening Up the Mountains festival is long over. We're hoping that we can get student participation in that, and that the public will join us. And we urge people everywhere to join this incredibly powerful movement, which is taking place all over the country. There are many, many different organizations that are working on this. Some of them are working together, some of them are working independently. The Poor People's Campaign, I think, is probably the largest of these organizations, headed by Bishop Barber and Reverend Theo Harris. It's
Liz Theo Harris, her name is.
What's her
Reverend Liz? Liz
Theo Harris, right. And of course, again, that's a continuation of the campaign that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King started in the 1960s, and Bishop Barber has taken over, and Reverend Theo Harris have taken over so admirably, and they are intent on seeing this through. They're getting arrested. They're performing civil disobedience. It's a growing movement. More and more people are joining that. Buses of people will be going to Washington, D.C., I think on August 10th, if I'm not mistaken. And they're there now. In fact, they just finished a campaign. They went to Texas. They did a 32-mile walk that was meant to conjure up memories of the Selma to Montgomery March. And they marched to the state capitol in Austin, Texas. Willie Nelson performed. And there were thousands of people apparently who attended that. And this movement is building, and it has to. It's so very, very important.
Don't forget the Texas state, the Democrats of the state assembly in Texas are in Washington. They've
That's
left
right.
the state to deprive the legislature of a quorum so that they can't vote for this another of these terrible bills that would limit voting in the state of Texas.
That's right.
Yeah.
So their civil disobedience is leaving their home state so that they're not available to vote. For
Yeah,
this.
Texas is trying to pass probably the most draconian voter suppression measure yet, again claiming that they're doing it to prevent voter fraud, which is non-existent.
I think one of the scariest things I've been hearing talk of is these provisions for allowing state legislatures to overturn democratic, free and fair elections by declaring that there was some sort of fraud, whether they can prove it or not. That to me is just an appalling perversion of democracy as a whole. A deliberate attempt, like you said, towards a more authoritarian government where the government decides what votes they like and what they don't like. That's Russia. That's not the United States.
Right. Democracy is obviously not the goal in those states. The goal is a power grab. And
I think something people should be aware of, there's probably not a lot of people listening to this who watch Fox News, but Tucker Carlson, who's one of their big celebrities, is broadcasting from Hungary this week. He's very enamored of Viktor Orban, who has ushered into Hungary a really more authoritarian state. They have a constitution, the people vote, but that through gerrymandering and through the dominance of one party over all the other parties, they essentially have a one-party state. And that's the kind of thing that's being held up for admiration on that channel that gets pumped into so many homes in our country.
Well, and that's something else that's happening is just a misinformation campaign. You know, the whole what happened on January 6th was a result of a misinformation campaign that Trump won the election somehow, even though the Trump organization brought 60 court cases in various states and lost every one of them. They were thrown out by judges who were Trump appointed.
All over the country.
All over the country. That there was just simply no evidence for it, but they keep on repeating the same lies. And they are lies, and they're repeated by Fox News and other news out, Newsmax and other. That's all part of this this same effort to delete our democracy. And they have no qualms about preventing citizens from voting, and even if they lose even after doing that in trying to overturn elections, legitimately or not. What's happened in Arizona, where the Republican state legislature physically took the machines out of the state and said that they counted it, and even then they only found, what was it, you said 600 votes?
300.
According to them, they found 600 votes that were not, were not legitimate.
Were not proven. They just thought something might be
Maybe
wrong.
the signature wasn't clear or something. I mean,
those
but
bamboo
it
fibers.
wouldn't have changed the results of the election anyway.
Right. I think we would be remiss to not talk about the Electoral College and how that also perverts our democratic process by allowing small numbers of people in large geographical areas to override the will of the majority over and over again. A citizen of, say, Utah has more ballot power than like 30,000 Californians or some tens of thousands. It's tens of thousands to one. And that's allowed continuous power grab by the minority over the majority, and that is not how our Constitution was originally. The minority should get some voice, but they should not be allowed to control.
Well, the phrase is minority rights, but majority rules.
Right.
So majorities they have rights, but what's happening now is the minority is ruling. And it's the Electoral College and the unfairness of that, but as well as the U.S. Senate itself and the way that it's set up, where Wyoming has as much representation as California.
Right.
And Wyoming, which has 700,000 people or less, and so
there are more people in Washington D.C. than there are in the state of Wyoming.
And so there's a movement to make Washington D.C. a state, and that's an important part of this discussion as well. Why should those American citizens, and they are fully American citizens, not be represented in the Senate?
They have a representative who has voice but not vote.
Right. Yeah, well, they should be represented in the Senate and in the House. That's right.
Right. So they don't really have. They do not have voting representation.
Right.
At all in Congress.
But you have like you have the North Dakota and South Dakota.
And when those, I mean, it's a funny story, really, when you'll hear Mitch McConnell talk about the D.C. statehood as just a power grab, but when and I think it was 1851, if I'm not mistaken, 6 states were added and they were all Republicans. They all resulted in Republican senators. And North Dakota and South Dakota were one territory, but they split it into North and South so that there'd be
They'd have more
representation. So they'd have 4 senators instead of just 2. So if it's a power grab, it's a power grab for the people, and I'm all in favor of it, because it's because that's where the power is supposed to reside in our country.
Regardless of whether it's a power grab or not, it's legitimate.
Oh yeah,
that's
absolutely.
the thing. I mean, those people should be represented.
Yeah,
There's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't be represented. And perhaps even Puerto Rico as well. If the Puerto Rican people want to become a state, they should be represented too, because they pay taxes, I believe, and
they pay taxes.
taxation without representation, wasn't that the reason this country?
It's one of the first things we learn about American history.
Started,
yeah.
So there are many imbalances and injustices within our constitutional government that need to be addressed. But the most immediate one is addressing the suppression of the vote and the purging of voter rolls and the.
We could even add restoring felons' voting rights to the whole discussion once they are out of prison. And making everybody pay exorbitant, arbitrary fines is really nothing short of a poll tax.
That's right.
That's
That's
exactly
absolutely
what
right.
that is.
Well,
And that's at reverse in Florida. A ballot measure was passed.
It's passed, and then
in 2018. It passed like with over 60% of the vote.
Very, very high vote.
That would allow felons who have served their time and paid their debt to society to vote. Of course they should. Why not? They're citizens as well.
Yes.
And there are many reasons people have been convicted and spent time in jail under felony charges in an unjust manner. Many of us would believe, for possession of marijuana, for instance, or other drugs, that
Wrong place, wrong time for a lot of inner
Right.
city youth who just happened to get
a lot of
with somebody who did something wrong.
what we'd
and
call victimless crimes,
that
and
too.
they were in the wrong state where it's a felony, in another state it may not be a felony, and so because of that conviction, they were denied the right to vote. Forever, right.
Yeah.
And so this Florida measure overturned that Florida law. And then the Republican state legislature decided to essentially negate what the voters decided by including all of these provisions that had to be met in order for those voters to vote, including having to pay fines that hadn't been paid yet, or whatever, and we're talking about tens of thousands of people, and as we know, the vote in Florida was very close.
Right.
Not only for president, but for governor. The governor won by a hair.
Yeah.
DeSantis won over what was the name of the mayor of Tallahassee?
I can't remember his name.
He was a black mayor of Tallahassee who was so well spoken. Everybody thought he was going to win, but then a lot of money came in from corporate political interests to defeat him, and gave the election by a hairline victory for DeSantis. Well, it's very possible that if all of these felons, former felons who have paid their price to society, if they weren't able to vote, it would have changed that election. You know, and the classic example is Bush v. Gore in
Right.
2000. What was it decided by? 500 something
500
votes,
something.
and actually even that was not accurate. If after a recount, it looked like Gore.
Supreme Court actually.
The Supreme Court won
ultimately,
5-4
decided that,
is
yeah.
what Bush won
Yeah.
the
Yeah,
election.
From 5 to 4.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
But so there are many inequities, but passing Senate Bill 1, I think, is the immediate priority. And we urge you to go to the website of the Poor People's Campaign and sign up, and maybe even get on the bus and go to D.C. next time
Yeah.
around.
And call your senators. Call your senators. It's in their hands now. Even our Republican senators who don't agree with us, don't assume that they can't be swayed.
That's right.
I call Burr and Tillis almost every day and also write to them. If you have the Messenger app on your phone, there's an entity called ResistBot, ResistBot, and you can use that to send a fax to your senators, and it's very, very easy. Happens instantaneously, and you don't need a stamp, so it's a good way to contact them. But calling them, the phone calls that they log are part of the public record, and it should be recorded that
That's
you
right.
wanted them to vote a certain way. Even if
And it
they
has an
don't.
impact. If they get thousands of letters
Yeah.
and emails, it makes them think, and it puts pressure on them. And that's how things change. In 1965, nobody thought the Voting Rights Act was going to pass. And Martin Luther King made a very famous statement when he was in his letter from the Birmingham jail, when people told him, well, there's no chance that you're going to get this passed now, wasting your time, go for something more moderate, And King said that we're not thermometers here to measure the temperature. We're thermostats here to change the temperature.
Wow.
And that's what we are, all of us, And there's no reason, yes, we should send letters and call our senators. Also call Joe Manchin, even though he's not your senator, and call Kristen Sinema's office. Register, tell them you're an American citizen and what they're doing is wrong.
Yeah.
Tell them to start representing the interests of the people and democracy.
I agree.
Yeah.
And to stop the slide towards autocratic behavior by the
Right.
Republican Party and the country in general.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you both for joining me in this conversation.
Thank you for hosting this.
Yes,
Alvin.
thank you.
Is there anything else anybody wants to say before we
No.
say goodbye? Get out there and participate,
Go- yeah.
folks.
Go vote.
Go
Go
vote.
vote.
Thank you.